We'll go ahead and get started. My co-facilitator, again, is having internet issues, and so she probably will not be able to join us, but she said if she does, she'll just hop in. So we'll go ahead and get started. One thing is that if people have comments or questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and talk, or add things to the chat or to the question box. You do have expertise in this because some of you have been working, obviously, in programs for a long time or have specific experience dealing with substance abuse issues. So please feel free to raise your hand or throw in some information. So again, this is going to be a pretty basic overview in a 1 hour or so webinar. And this information is actually part of the advanced certification. So that is the Certified Domestic Abuse Advocate. We talk about substance abuse a little bit. So something to remember is that this is going to be recorded too, so if people aren't able to be on, we'll have it on our website. So, do you have any questions before I begin? Okay. So, as we know, and has been in our experience, especially doing direct services to victims, is that there's a high correlation between substance abuse and domestic violence. And the Integrative Services Program, when it started back in the day, they had done interviews and surveys of women who are using shelter programs in safe homes about substance abuse use. And what they found is 1 in 4 women in Iowa shelters at that time had a lifetime diagnosis of alcohol dependence, and another 40% had alcohol or drug problems. And I guess the way that this can be skewed too is that these interviews were done, the appointments were made, and then the interviews were done over a week period. And as we know, sometimes with women who are abusing substances, their shelter stays sometimes don't last as long, or they can end abruptly, either because they know that they can't use while they're in shelter, or have been asked to leave because of it. And so this number is probably much higher than what's reported here. It's probably closer to the 90% range, which is actually what's reported by women who are in substance abuse treatment, that they have experienced intimate partner violence at some time in their life. So there's a high correlation. And the other reason is that generally the people we see at our programs, and especially in shelter programs, have multiple barriers to safety. And so it's not unusual that they would have substance and alcohol and drug abuse issues. So just some things to keep in mind is that we never allow batterers to use drugs or alcohol as an excuse for their violence. Therefore, we should not assume that every woman using our services with substance abuse issues will become violent. And substance abuse is many times used as a reason to screen women out of shelter. And it's done for a variety of reasons. They think that substance abuse, if someone who's actively using substances is going to trigger someone who's in shelter, that they're going to become violent, they're going to become unruly, and they're not going to be able to quote-unquote follow program guidelines. And the thing is that substance abuse should never be a reason to screen someone out of shelter. That the reason we exist are to help people who are in violent relationships, and regardless of their substance abuse use. And so it's really important to keep that in mind. And again, as we don't allow batterers to use drugs and alcohol as an excuse for violence, we can't make assumptions about people who are using substances. Now, there obviously is that kind of blanket rule, you can't use drugs or alcohol while you're in shelter, but best practice is that so you don't let people use in shelter, but they absolutely can come back to shelter even if they've been using. I would rather have a woman who is using substances, whether it's drugs or alcohol, coming back to shelter and staying within the facility than not allowing them in and having them sleep in a car, go back to their abuser, or end up in another unsafe situation. So it's really important to keep that in mind. And I realize it can create some additional issues or difficulty when sheltering lots of people, but it is really important that we not use that as a screening tool to keep women out of shelter. And the reality is, too, is that people need to get their needs met. And so if they've been using substances as a form of coping, and then they come into shelter and all of a sudden they're not able to use that coping anymore, it's not necessarily fair. So it's getting them connected with the right services, and presenting an environment where they can be open to talking about what their actual needs are. Because if you're not open to hearing about it, they're just in many cases going to lie to you about their use. So I would much rather have someone that feels open and accepted and safe than someone who has to lie to me about their substance abuse use. The importance of this, too, is that you should just be aware of the signs and symptoms of substance abuse so you're able to provide the best advocacy and referrals possible. That's the really important thing. Has anyone else lost sound? I just got somebody who said that they lost sound. Oh, it's back. Never mind. Because this is done over the internet and over the phone, we may have occasional breakups in sound, and I apologize. It's just a much easier way to do it than having to attach ourselves to a phone line. So, of course, we know that the types of abuse that substance abusing battered women experience are the same as everyone else: domestic violence or intimate partner violence, child abuse and neglect, sexual assault, child sexual abuse, emotional, physical, and economic abuse, and other forms of oppression. So this is, again, substance abuse is an additional barrier to getting safe. So, and why do people use substances? Some of them use them as a recreational drug, but many times they're used as coping. So they use to cope with abuse, whether that's that their partner uses substances also, and it actually is just easier if they use them right along. Their partner may have forced them to use them. Their partner may have forced them to participate in distributing or manufacturing drugs. And it could be just easier if their partner's using that they use right along with them, because perhaps they're not as violent when they are using. So there's many reasons. And it's not just substance abuse that they're using to cope with the abuse. We have gambling and eating disorders, compulsive spending, excessive working, sexually acting out. So there are a lot of what are considered negative behaviors that are also used with coping with abuse to keep in mind. So we always ask, there's always the question asked, why doesn't she just leave? So she's in an abusive relationship, why doesn't she just leave? We have people, and it makes us crazy. Why do people keep saying that? Why is it about her? Well, we ask the same question about people who are using substances, and it's, why don't you just quit? Just quit using. And it's not as easy as just quitting. Just as it's not as easy just to leave, it's the same. You keep stopping to use substances. They're the physiological, addictive aspects of it. And if it's what they've used as their main coping tool or coping mechanism, if there's nothing there to replace it or no help or support around it, how do we expect her to just quit using? And as with people in abusive relationships, they don't leave the relationship until they're ready to leave. And so, a lot of people using substances don't quit using substances until they're ready to quit. And just as women leave many times and go back, women using substances vacillate back and forth between recovery and use. So just some subtle substance abuse cues that you could notice of people that you're working with. And the reason why we point out the cues is because if you know what the person's issues are, then you can make the more appropriate referrals. So if you know that someone's using substances, then you can offer resources in substance abuse treatment or support group. It helps you understand exactly what they need more. So keeping in mind that the substance abuse cues aren't for you to identify people and then ask them to leave, but to actually provide them with better advocacy. So again, odor of alcohol, chemicals, etc. Loud, overly friendly, hostile, or argumentative are possibilities. Everyone kind of runs the gamut. Some people when they've been drinking, they're really, really nice and fun, and then some people when they're drinking are mean and violent. So there's a continuum there. Sudden move shifts, bad language or sullen, difficulty with fine motor tasks, signing name, lighting cigarettes. Cigarette burns on the skin, it may be an indication of domestic violence. Loss of train of thought, slurred speech, or speaking very deliberately. Rapid speech also can be a sign. And again, it just depends on the substance that's actually being used. Again, more cues: head bobbing, eyelid drooping, looks sleepy, could be hoarse, sniffling, etc. Staggering, swaying while standing still, red eyes dilated or pinpoint pupils, track marks, burn marks on clothes, tremors, agitation, disorientation, rapid pulse or respiration, scratching or picking at arms or face. So, of course, these aren't always an indication that someone may be using drugs or alcohol, but these obviously are cues or things that you can look for. And, that spectrum of drugs is very large, from, marijuana to heroin to meth to prescription drugs. And as you know, we see all this entire spectrum of drug use with the people we work with. I remember when I was working in shelter, I feel like the biggest use was with prescription drugs with clients, things that they were obtaining through their doctor. There was also a lot of meth use, and then alcohol. So it's good to understand, too, that there are long-term effects from substance use that then affect how someone functions later on in life. So some of the long-term effects are tolerance for substances. So it takes more to actually get the high that they, or try to attempt to get the high they did before. This kind of loss of control. Continued use despite adverse consequences. So continuing to use it even though there are risks involved. And again, if you think about it, people using this as coping over a long period of time. Again, continuing to use it, even if it is bad for you, it's helping with your coping. And then withdrawal syndrome. So, we talk about why women don't just quit. Well, there are symptoms. It's altered your brain chemistry, which leads to stress, cravings, denial, and relapse potential. It changes the chemistry in your brain. So say someone does heroin, and they've never had it before, and so you put the chemical into your body, and your body responds by dumping lots and lots of chemicals into your system, and you get this high because that's how your body responds to it. It's a foreign substance that you've never experienced before, and so you take it, and it goes up really high, and you get that high. Well, the next time you take it, your body doesn't respond necessarily the same way because it's already been introduced. So your body doesn't respond with the same maybe amount of chemicals that it did before. So your high isn't necessarily as big because then it knows, okay, when this happens, this is what I need to do. And so the high isn't as great or as pure as maybe it was the first time. And then as you go along and you continue to take it, your body again adapts to that response. So then if someone just decides to stop taking, your body is still producing the chemicals in order to block that stimulus response to the substance. So if you don't take it, then you have this dump of chemicals that make you sick, and you go through withdrawal. And so that's kind of the elementary explanation of kind of withdrawal and your body responding to drugs, and then potentially why it's hard to then get off of them. And what I've heard, and I don't know because, self-disclosure, never really used anything, that it's easier because the withdrawal symptoms are so significant, even if someone isn't getting as high, may continue to use the drugs just to stave off the withdrawal symptoms because they're so significant and you get so sick from it. So the tolerance is just the need for significantly larger amounts of the substance to achieve intoxication. It's a little different with alcohol because if someone's a severe alcoholic, the damage that it's done to your body, sometimes it doesn't take as much because your body can't process the alcohol in the same way. So if you've been a long-time alcoholic, many people think that it's, well, they can drink a lot. Well, the reality is too is in some cases with advanced alcoholism is that your liver can't process the alcohol at all. So it actually affects, smaller amounts affect you more than they did in the past. There's withdrawal, which is the adverse reaction to a reduction of a substance. So your body is shooting out chemicals to combat what that substance is doing to you, but the substance isn't there, and so your body's going through all of this kind of turmoil, which is causing withdrawal symptoms and making you sick. Substance use disorder or addiction is characterized by continuous or periodic impaired control over drinking alcohol or using other drugs, preoccupation with use, use despite adverse consequences, and distortions in thinking. So this denial that we talked about. So this just is a diagram of the brain. And that's all. Nothing really to explain with it at this point. So, let's talk about the long-term effects of use on women. So alcohol metabolizes differently for women than it does for men. Females' digestive systems are different than men. Women have a menstrual cycle. Alcohol absorbs faster in women than in men, which can affect women's liver faster. So how the genders process alcohol is very different. And again, then how it affects them long-term can be different. Marijuana use, long-term use to block the neuron pathways to the brain. I was listening to NPR the other day, and they had a story about they had done a study of long-term marijuana use and its effect on your IQ. And they found that long-term use of marijuana actually it does affect your IQ. And I can't remember the exact number, so I can't say, but there's definitely a correlation in use. And alcohol kills brain cells, and brain cells don't regenerate. And so it's like when they're gone, they're gone. So distortions in perception. So we have this idea of what it is like when someone gets drunk, the passing out, which is falling asleep or becoming unconscious from excessive alcohol or drug consumption. So that's passing out, falling asleep. There's euphoric recall, memories formed under the influence, and so they're formed with distortion. It may be used as an appropriate excuse to minimize, rationalize, or deny behavior. So if someone's under the influence and they're being abused, someone could say, "Oh, you're only recalling it in that way because you've been using drugs and alcohol." And then the blackout. And blackout isn't actually falling asleep. Blackout is like an amnesia period often associated with heavy drinking. So when someone says they black out, they're still conscious in a sense, like they're up and they can even be talking and interacting, but they don't remember anything that they just did. So it literally like is amnesia. So there's no memory associated with what just happened. So while blackouts impact memory, there's no evidence to support contention that blackouts alter judgment or behavior at the time of the occurrence. You just don't know what happened. So when someone says they blacked out, sometimes they use that term in the sense that they actually passed out or fell asleep. But actually blackout is that you're physically awake, however you don't remember. You can't store the memory. You don't remember what happened. So dangers for battered women using alcohol and other drugs. So impaired cognition made safety planning more difficult. So just the impact on memory and on impaired decision making can make safety much more difficult. The effects of substance abuse may prevent accurate assessment of how dangerous the situation is by the perpetrator. And then affects their capacity to defend against physical assault. So if someone is drunk, and they're unable to walk well, they're unable to drive, their capacity to defend themselves or get away from an abuser are impaired. And then the level of danger is skewed, so they may not understand the level of danger that's happening at the time. Also, individuals impacted by substances may be reluctant to seek assistance or contact police for fear of arrest, deportation, or referral to a child protection agency. So if you're both under the influence of drugs at the time of an assault, even though the person's substance use at the time shouldn't affect or be an excuse for someone to assault them, there's still that fear, and there's still the chance that they could be impacted negatively by calling the police. And so they're reluctant to do so because the fear of getting arrested. Again, it kind of goes back to that kind of throwing things back on the victim. So compulsive youth withdrawal symptoms may make it difficult to access shelter, advocacy, and other forms of help. So if you have guidelines around your program saying you can't use substances while you're in shelter, and what I mean by in shelter meaning you can't be using it all if you're staying here, even if you're using outside of shelter, it makes it difficult for people to access safe shelter advocacy. As we talked about earlier with withdrawal symptoms, expecting someone to come into shelter and then stop using completely in an environment that can't support that coming down, that's a big expectation. And so it's not surprising we see women coming in and out of shelter when they've been using or not using. A recovering woman might find stress of securing safety leads to relapse. So making those connections that will help and continue to aid in her recovery. Though our programs aren't set up to, provide substance abuse counseling, it is important that we can then connect survivors with agencies within our communities that can help address those needs safely. If she is using or has used in the past, she may not be believed. So you may have had someone come to your program before who was using substances. They may have left, they're currently not using, and they still might not be believed coming back, which again can close an avenue for shelter or for getting services. Though it's not something that is allowed by state standards, which is keeping a list or having a list of folks that can't come back into shelter because there have been previous incidents before, that those lists shouldn't exist, and everyone should be allowed back into shelter regardless of their previous behavior. Not to say that you may have to ask the person to leave again for using violent behavior, but they still should have kind of a clean slate coming back in and getting services. And that they need to be believed when they come back. So a culturally competent intervention incorporates a couple of things. So awareness of own biases, prejudice, and knowledge about people we serve in their culture. So being very honest with ourselves and how we respond to people who are under the influence of drugs and alcohol. It could be because in our life we ourselves have experienced issues with drugs and alcohol and we're clean, and then how we respond to clients who aren't and the judgment that can be passed through there. It could be our experience with working with other survivors who have been using substances. It could be from our just collective history. Maybe we grew up in a home with an alcoholic, and then we have a certain response to people who are also using alcohol. So we have to be very aware of that. And then we also have to the recognition of professional power. It's the power differential between you and a client. And it's in order to avoid imposing one's values on others. And I think this is something that happens across the board that we need to be aware of, is that even though we come in, whether we set it up that way or not, there is a power imbalance because we're in a position of power. In a sense, we can be seen as gatekeepers to getting services and not. So it's really equalizing that and making sure that we understand that we have that. It's also important to remember that people who are under the influence or of drugs or alcohol may have a difficulty reporting actually what is happening. So their memory of the events may be completely or partially unavailable. It could have been something that happened out during a time when they were blacked out. They just don't have the memories. The elements of the events may be missing in out of chronological order. We know that trauma and how it affects the brain and how it can put memories in the wrong order, or that it might throw out information that is pertinent. So trauma coupled with drugs or alcohol can make that more difficult. Oftentimes the amount of alcohol or other substances consumed is underreported. So if you do call the police or if you do report it, not many people are going to go, yeah, I had just, smoked, whatever, a bowl. Generally don't like to report their own substance use, so that can go very underreported. And even the use of the person that you're with can go underreported because you don't want to be identified for other reasons. The individual may not be able to identify people, places, or details of events because they were under the influence. So you go to the police, you want to do a report, but you don't remember any of the details. Can be difficult and confusing, and it can also make officers or other law enforcement upset, and that they may not believe what you're actually telling them. So it can be difficult, and then there can be a lot of broken trust. And especially if they've been kind of in drug culture or for a long time, they may have had other experiences with law enforcement having to do with drug use that could make them less likely to report. So helping people under the influence. People under the influence may be uncooperative, unwilling, or unable to provide useful information. Sometimes very little can be gained by trying to get an in-depth interview at the time. So if you're meeting with someone, you get called to the police station, you're meeting with someone who's under the influence, that time might not be the right time to sit down there and talk to them about what's going on. Maybe it needs to happen when they're in a different state. It is not necessary to force someone to admit they're under the influence. It's not you trying to prove a point. It's not necessary to force them to do that. And also being prepared to reschedule if necessary. If someone's under the influence at the time and they're not at a place or don't have the capacity at that point to really talk with you in depth, or that it's going to be useful, be prepared to set up another time to do that. Other ways to help is actually screening people when they come in, but it's not to deny services, but determining how to best accommodate what they need. So if someone comes in and they're a severe alcoholic and you kind of gloss over the fact that alcoholism is a barrier for them, that may just make it difficult to do all other parts of advocacy. That's what's so important about integrative services, is that you're addressing both problems at the same time. So you're addressing the domestic violence and the substance abuse at the exact same time as you're moving forward. Because doing one or the other, you might not have as much success. Do not put information pertaining to substance use, misuse, or dependent in a program participant's file. And I kind of squawk on this often, which is very few notes that actually go in a client's file, and always remember that what does the file say if anyone were to get a hold of it? It's really just about the services you provided and not the details about the person, because you need to think about how that could potentially affect them in the future. So talk about substance use, but normalize it in the conversation. So make it a part of your everyday advocacy. I talk to everyone about this to ensure our ability to accommodate people we serve. This conversation will not be used to deny services, so being very upfront and honest about it. Women may actually find it easier to talk about stress in their relationship or their partner's substance use before talking about DV or their own use. So it can actually be a gateway to start actually talking about the abuse. And so it's kind of really feeling out where the person's going to go in the conversation, and then the best avenue to take that. Cage, this is just a way of asking questions, or a series of questions to, instead of saying, do you use drugs or alcohol, which can be kind of abrasive, and people may be less likely to not actually answer your question because they're feeling accused. So asking questions in a different way. Have you ever felt you ought to cut down or stop using drugs? Has anyone annoyed you or gotten on your nerves by telling you to cut down or stop drinking or using drugs? Have you ever felt guilty or bad about how much you drink or use? Have you been waking up wanting to have an alcoholic drink or use drugs? We do this in how we question questions we ask to women who are coming into our services. So sometimes people don't use or identify with the word domestic violence, but they may see, have you ever felt like you had to have sex with your partner in order to prevent a fight, etc.? So it's just a way in asking questions that may make it easier for them to actually answer. Other questions that can kind of lead you into that. So, does your partner have a problem with drugs or alcohol? So getting into the partner's use and then see kind of how that rolls out. Many women also tell me the best way to cope is to smoke a cigarette, have a drink, or take something else. How often has that worked for you? Do you find it still working? So actually talking to them about how they've coped and then starting to kind of unfold what that is. Many women tell me their partners don't want to drink, drug, or smoke alone. How often do you find yourself using when you don't really want to? When a partner spends family money on drug use, that is a form of economic abuse. Has your partner ever used food or rent money to drink or score drugs? So again, it's the structure of the question and how you're asking it. They're not accusatory. And then when you're talking about safety, can you think about reasons why drinking or using substances might not be the safest option right now? How might your partner use substances against you? If there's one thing I could do for you today, what would that be? So asking them about their use and then asking them what they need and what they want. Remember, all of our services are voluntary. Nothing is required. So it's actually asking them what they need and then providing them the services that they need. Even if someone is unwilling or not wanting to get any assistance with their substance abuse, if you make it known that you're there regardless, the likelihood that when they leave that they'll probably come back again is higher because they know that you're a safe person to go to, regardless if they've stopped using or not. So kind of ways to respond then. These are some that we know obviously, regardless of substance use, but no one has the right to hurt you. You didn't deserve this. It is never your fault when someone harms you, even if you were drinking or using. You did not cause this. An abuser chose to be violent. So again, drugs and alcohol are never an excuse to perpetrate violence, but it's also never an excuse to have violence perpetrated against you. I'm also glad you found a way to survive. Drinking or drugging can kill pain for a while, but there are safer ways of coping that can cause you less grief. You deserve a lot of credit for finding the strength to talk about this. Your safety can improve your children's safety and well-being too. So just different messages that you can send to somebody that aren't accusatory, that can make them feel more at home or comfortable. You're acknowledging harm's been done, but you're not re-victimizing. Again, the abuse is not for your fault or safety. Telling people that using drugs to cope is a bad choice may be a way to turn them off. That, here I'm going to this agency and they don't actually understand what I'm going through. This is not an easy thing to deal with, and they're basically telling me I'm wrong or I made a bad decision. That's not the most effective way to get people to trust you. Active abuse is traumatic and painful. People do their best to survive. You deserve credit for surviving. Offer options to make coping and surviving safer. So, here in our office, and I know some of you are using the program also, Seeking Safety talks about post-traumatic stress disorder, trauma, and substance abuse in a way that you can move forward dealing with trauma without continuing to use drugs. So there's curriculum available also that allows you to do that, that can help you through it. So at the prison, we do a lot of, okay, so normally you would cope by going out and getting drunk. So what do you do now? What are other ways that you can cope with the abuse or what's going on in your life that is safer and isn't harmful to you? And really talking about those things. So I talked really fast. I really wish Barb would have been on the call with us because she has lots of experience doing domestic violence work and working with substance abuse. I want questions and comments about your experiences. If you raise your hand, I can unmute you so you can talk. I can also read your questions. Again, this was just like a very kind of like basic kind of overview, cues, and how to respond to people who are coming to you who are using substances. Does anyone have anything they want to share? I know many of you have experience, more in-depth experience working with folks who are using substances or formally. So I know in Ottumwa, Southeast Iowa, they have the Moms Off Meth program that they started, working with victims who were former meth users in their recovery, which has been a tremendous program. Anybody? Oh, here we have a question. When we see overuse of pills and address it, how do you feel about termination of services if they refuse help and continue to use and access? I believe that people can determine their own course, and it's their decision if they want to continue to use. If they're not being violent, and like violating kind of that policy of your program, which is really the most important one, I don't believe they should be asked to leave. People will decide to get help when they want to. And what you can do is you can provide them the information. The difficulty is that I know that people have, when people bring their own prescription drugs in, they sometimes keep them in the office. And the thing is we're not in a position to be actually giving people their drugs. They should have access to them freely. So whether that's you have a locker system at your program with keys that they can get them into the office. It's great to hear, as someone just said the comment, we don't keep them in the office. I think that's great that everyone's kind of in control of their own medication. I would say that what you do is you provide the best advocacy you can to get the help that they need, but ultimately it's their decision if they want to quit. And so providing them with all of the resources possible to do that, but ultimately if they refuse, that's their choice because they're an adult, and I know that it's difficult, especially when you see someone going in a very bad place. It's difficult. How can we help a person see and accept that she has a problem with alcohol when she does not see it? Well, I think it's really up to that person to decide when they want to see it. And even though it is difficult, and I think it's your job to provide referrals and to provide resources and to voice your concerns, but you can't really make them accept anything until they're ready to do that. What about looking towards moving from shelter to permanent housing, and the women who aren't abusing will stay forever if we don't set a boundary? I think working towards goals are one thing. If people are in a safe place and they've been at shelter and it's really a matter of the fact that they're still there, I think it's setting goals and setting a deadline, but just asking them to leave because they're using, I don't think is the answer. But I think moving towards permanency, obviously, I think is important, and being able to move out of shelter. So setting goals and I think ultimately a timeline to move them forward when there are options there, I think that's okay. And then, okay, so you've provided all the resources possible. At what point is it time not to provide services? I think you always provide services because regardless of what you're doing, I think that you still have to continue to provide advocacy. And if it gets to the point where it's not even that they want advocacy anymore, then I think you're just honest with them about that you want to provide services. It doesn't seem as though it's something that they need anymore, and that you would like to get them connected with someone else. I realize that people can burn you out, and really that's where a lot of this comes from. It's feeling burned out by people who you feel are dragging their feet. But regardless of what's happening, there's obviously still, and there have been issues in the past, and no matter how difficult they are, we still have to continue to help the best that we can. I don't think there's one can answer for this. And then kind of a follow-up to abusing if we don't set. So someone who won't do anything towards their goals, I think it's okay to set exit dates, and if they decide not to work towards their goals, I think it's okay to refer them on to a new location. Now, if they call and they need to come back, I think you bring them back. But I think it is important just to set goals, and if they don't work towards them, I think you need to come up with an ultimate plan. I don't think it's one where you say, you have to leave today because you're not working further, but actually setting something up with them. And, I mean, I think it's a case-by-case basis. And I would hope that it's not the majority of people that aren't working towards their goals. They're generally, at least as I remember, kind of a snag sometimes, where someone would come along every once in a while and it would be difficult to help them move forward because they kind of seem stationary. Any advice on helping a survivor who comes to court intoxicated? Well, I think talking about your... I would say that you talk to them about their concerns and that what the potential problem is with them going into court intoxicated. And then ultimately, I mean, you can share that with them. What the possible outcome is of going into court intoxicated, and then they get to make that decision. And then someone said, I'm thinking of trauma for staff finding a resident dead from an overdose. We don't have the yeah, I think you do, but we also have to think about the work that we're doing. And so, yeah, of course, I think we care about staff and we have responsibility, but we also have responsibility to the women that we're serving. And so I think not that it's fun, but I think as staff, there are certain things we need to be prepared for. And so that's something to talk about. But I don't think sending someone out who's using substances out onto the street where it is definitely probably unsafe for them is the answer either. And then someone said, I think we see some of these same issues with clients who are not using. We do what we're able to do, and I think that's a really good point. This isn't just limited to people who aren't using or who are using. It happens to women who are using. And we also have to think that in shelter, especially, you're getting people with the most barriers to exist because, remember, if they didn't have those barriers, they would not be coming to shelter. Shelter is not a fun place. This is, and I'm going to share a little of my opinion here too, but shelter is not a place you want to go. It's kind of a place of last resort. If they had other options, they would be using it. Whether you think that they're coming in because they're just homeless or there is really a safety consideration, there are obviously some significant barriers that have existed in their life that have led us to this point, whether it's substance abuse, whether it's mental health issues, whether it's just generally poverty. This isn't like the best option, except it may be the only option for them at the time. So we just have to remember that, and I commend the things that you're doing, because this is really, really, really hard. There are no good answers, and I think it's just continuing to move forward. So someone had the question, what about people in shelter who are working really hard on staying clean and sober? How hard would it be for them to be living with people who are using? I think it's okay to ask people who are using to go to their room. I think it's important to be cognizant, but I don't think you should kick one or the other out, because, again, shelter is a place where so many worlds collide anyway, and it's generally never a harmonious and like even-keeled place. And so it's really just talking to them both about that. I don't think that one deserves priority over the other. I think it's just you're going to have to deal with it when it comes. Again, difficult question. And someone said, how can you provide support and care for those who are going through drug or alcohol withdrawal? I think you try to help them as much as you can, whether that's making sure that they have a room by themselves, talking about potential or possible options for them. So if they're going through withdrawal or they intend on stopping, is it important to connect them with a substance abuse agency that could possibly help with that, whether they have an in-treatment program or help for possibly detox. I think that those are just some of the barriers or the hurdles that you deal with working in shelter. So it may be that you make sure that the client has a room by themselves where they're able to do that. But again, it's talking to the client about what they need specifically. There's no, again, canned answers to this. Every person that comes into shelter is different. They could be the same age using the same drug and they could respond completely different. And I think it's important to keep that in mind, to not just kind of have this canned response to each person that comes in. And again, right, and Cheryl, thank you. Detox can be a dangerous time and could need medical care. And so I absolutely, and making sure that you know what the client needs, and that if something happens, just like if someone were to fall down the stairs at your shelter and be injured, if you need to call for medical care, you call for medical care. If you're concerned for the life of the person, it is really important to do that. That's why it's so vital that we're connected with the substance abuse agencies in our communities, because they know the resources that exist. And so that's why I think it's vitally important to do that. So if you don't currently have a relationship with them, it's finding that and being connected with them. And it's not that you need to become experts on substance abuse, but that you know enough and you know about the connections that you're able to get clients to the people that can help. I think that that's vital here. And again, I want to acknowledge that this is super hard, that doing shelter is very difficult, and sheltering people from different backgrounds with different mental health issues or substance abuse issues is difficult. But to remember not to pigeonhole people into a certain behavior that creates an additional barrier for them to getting services. I can tell you that I would rather have someone who's going through detox in my shelter than having them in their car in the park. I would rather be there to help them as much as I can. Oftentimes the word liability gets brought up. You have insurance. You're acting in good faith and you're trying to help someone. Don't let that be a factor that's keeping you from providing them the service. That's why we exist, and I know that it gets frustrating and I know that it gets exhausting because you're dealing with folks with multiple barriers. But that's why our programs exist, and that's why they need the help. I think that that's also part of the reason, as we're talking about the whole reorganization, is talking about this move from kind of emergency shelters to rapid rehousing. So keeping people in their own homes or moving them into more permanent housing immediately because of the energy that it takes to run a shelter program. Not that they aren't absolutely necessary, but being able to devote some money to more outreach efforts and helping them. Maybe that's working with your substance abuse agency, so you're there, once or twice a week. There's an advocate available for clients that are using both services. So it's coming up with other collaborative relationships that can make it easier to access that. But what you're doing is difficult, and I hear what all of your concerns are. And again, these are coming from somebody who's not working in shelter currently and who has some distance from it. So these are, again, things that you should strive for, even though it's frustrating. And anytime you have a situation where you're feeling overwhelmed or frustrated, call me and just say, I know what the right answer is, but I just need to vent about this right now. Those are things that I appreciate, because we can't do this. We can't do this stuff alone, and we do care about what's happening with your program, what's happening with your staff, because this is really difficult work. Does anyone else have any questions or comments? A lot of good questions, a lot of good comments. I really appreciate your feedback. And the information I'm sharing, I'm obviously coming from the domestic violence kind of services side of it. And, I'm working with the Integrative Services Program, and we're working with substance abuse professionals. And I absolutely still have a lot to learn about substance abuse itself. But again, the most important thing is being aware, being open, being available to provide people with what they need and the referrals that they need. And yep, and I can send out the PowerPoint. If you just want to shoot me an email, I would be happy to send you the PowerPoint that I put together. Again, it's very simple. And again, I wish that Barb could have been on the call with us just because of her collective history working in this particular field. But again, I want to thank you for taking the time to listen, to be here with this webinar. I know things are a little chaotic for a lot of you right now, and I just want you to know that I'm here to support you and to listen. So, again, thank you.